Chapter 3, Grinder Gripes. It wasn't supposed to be like this. None of it was. And somewhere, deep down in the center of his spark chamber, places Grinder never went to, there was one bedrock truth. It was all his fault. He was great. Was. Definitely past tense. A class 3 from an exceedingly wealthy family, one of the wealthiest in the galaxy. Before the war. When he had entered the Autobot War Academy to become an officer in the Autobot Army, his family had cheered him. It was the talk of high society. He was going to save the Cybertronian Empire from every conceivable threat. The Quintessons, the Nebulons, even Cosmic Rust. Who cared that the Nebulons were at peace with Cybertron and that Cosmic Rust already had a cure? He was the great hope of all of Cybertron. Well, next to Optimus Prime and Elita 1. Soon enough, his name would ring out greater than theirs, even greater than the greatest bots in history. He was supposed to carry the weight of Cybertron on his shoulders to protect them all. That's how it was supposed to go. The Cybertronian Empire was gone. The space bridge network destroyed. The Decepticons had arisen under Galvatron Prime and wreaked havoc across the planet, leaving the shining jewel of the galaxy a rusting pile of slag. Grinder had done everything he could, giving up his own life to stop it, to protect Cybertron, and it had all failed. That wasn't how it was supposed to be, but that's how it was. He hadn't been born Grinder. His progenitors had given him a different name. They say Cybertronians had two names, the one you were born with and the one you earn. Optimus Prime had been born Orion Pax. Grinder had three names in his life, in his far too long life. The one he was born with, the one he earned, and now he was Grinder. He didn't acknowledge the other names. He didn't answer to them. They were someone else. They were names of a hero who sacrificed himself in the middle of this accursed war. He should have died on that battlefield, but he couldn't even do that right. He spent a year, his body broken, shot through by blaster fire, every cyber muscle snapped, every sensor shattered. The only thing left intact was his processor and a spark chamber. A year, unable to speak, unable to hear, unable to see, unable to move. Useless, like he was now. Secundus' crew had found him. Doc had managed a spark transplant, not an easy procedure, transferring his mind from his irreparably broken body into the body of some Class 1 who couldn't be salvaged. He was Grinder then, but he didn't know it yet. He hadn't earned it yet. But he would. And that got him here. Hiding under some scrap sheet metal he had set up as an impromptu lean-to, just a bit of concealment so he could provide overwatch for one of the worst teams in the history of the Autobot Army. Secundus was an idiot. The strategy was working. The war was all but over. There were barely any bots left on Cybertron. Most of us had gone offline from lack of energon, not from damage. Most of us. Grinder had made sure many Decepticons had gone offline from damage. It was the least he could do. At that thought, a grin came across Grinder's face. It didn't stop him from scanning the skies. The entire crew was out today. Out of the base, out in the open, investigating some energon signal that civilian forager had found after that earthquake. It was supposed to be big enough to be a Class 4 bot, which would be about the only thing that would get Secundus to abandon the strategy. The only thing that would convince Secundus to let Doc out of the base. If they lost Doc, then they really lost Cybertron. We're weeding out the Decepticons. Everyone in Secundus' crew had a solar port. They could turn light into energon. As long as there was sunlight or starlight, then their small crew would never run out of energon. The Decepticons were burning through their energon. There were only Seekers left, at least. They hadn't seen a named Khan in decades, and Seekers were stupid. All too young, younger even than Grunt, and dumb as a lump of scrap, flying around like the fools they were, looking to blast bots into scrap as the world died around them. Let them. That was the strategy. Let them use up their energon until they all went offline. If the Autobots stayed in their base, hidden from the Decepticreeps, they would win. That was a good strategy. A guaranteed win. This was stupid. chasing energon shadows on scanners. Unicron takes Secundus. Even if this was a Class 4 bot under this rubble, even if it was a Class 5, there wasn't enough energon on Cybertron to bring it back online. Bringing out the whole crew was a mistake, especially Doc. Grinder would have sent out Grunt. The big lunk was practically indestructible. Maybe Forager to lead him here. Grunt tended to get lost in the base, let alone out in the ruins of Cybertron. Forager would have orders to run at the first sign of trouble, and Grunt would have orders to keep Forager alive. Forager couldn't fight his way out of a tin shack. That was how Grinder would have handled it. If he was in command. Not that anyone would ever put him in command again. He'd lost his commission and dropped down to enlisted rank. Technically, Grunt outranked him now. It's not how it was supposed to be. Forager's annoying whining came over the AM radio. 2 pings on my radar. Grinder didn't have a radar anymore. Secundus had made him take a solar port when they put the strategy in place. Grinder didn't have room for it, so I had to give up his radar. They had exchanged a few words. To Doc's credit, the surgery was exceedingly quick. Grinder keyed his own internal mic and broadcast a long sigh, followed by a vector, or at least a location would be good, so I could shoot them. It was a wide broadcast, mildly encrypted, so the whole crew could hear them. The other 3 members of the crew were standing out in the open, above the area where the large energon signal was coming from. Grunt was ripping up the rubble of the ground with his bare hands, Secundus directing and assisting him. Doc was standing a ways away, holding a large, super nerdy science scanner Grunt had carried out there for him. It was too heavy for Doc to carry it out on his own. They hadn't responded to Forager's broadcast yet. Idiots. Get under cover, Grinder broadcast. Good idea, Forager said. I'll get to ground and lose them. Grinder sighed over the air again. Not you. The 3 on the ground started to move, Grunt and Secundus picking up Doc and putting him in the hole they were digging. Secundus started climbing in too. Doc was tiny. There was plenty of room. Secundus could use the hole as cover and concealment and get a few surprise shots off. This was quickly becoming a classic ambush scenario. Excellent. Grunt was waiting to climb in the hole too. Secundus should know better. Idiots. Grunt, get a distance away and play decoy. Grinder didn't want any blaster fire getting near Doc. Forget the energon signal. Doc had to be protected. Grinder watched as Secundus made some hand gestures, pointing out to Grunt where to go. Grinder sighed again, this time off the air. I need that location, Forager. I'm north of you, and they're to my southeast, so... Got it, Grinder said, cutting Forager off as Grinder slowly repositioned himself towards the threat. Are they in the air or on the ground? Scrap! They're turning toward me. Air! Forager was freaking out. Civilian. He was not supposed to outrank Grinder. On the ground, the very large Secundus pointed at the smaller Grunt again, showing him where to go. Grinder shook his head. Grunt was amazing in a fight, probably the best hand-to-hand combatant Grinder had ever seen, but getting to the fight was difficult for him. Secundus, Grunt, are you 2 set? Getting there, Grunt growled. He had a deep, scary voice that belayed his small stature. I'm good, Secundus said. Lead them in, Forager. And try not to get your chassis shot off, Grinder added. Forager claimed to be a scientist, an explorer and a geologist, and blah, 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 blah. They'd been stuck in the base for so long because of the strategy that Grinder had heard it 1,000,000,000, billion, trillion times. That wasn't what he'd observed, though. As much as Forager was claiming to love all this science scrap, the fact was he went stir-crazy faster than any of them. As much as he loved exploring, Forager loved flying more, and driving. Like most bots, he loved racing. Racing and fighting. All the time in the galaxy, with unlimited energy, and Cybertronian culture was all about racing and fighting. Idiots. The upside was that Forager could fly circles around these seekers, if he could keep his cool. Grinder wasn't worried much. They got into visual range, but not in range of his fusion cannon. Grinder favored the fusion cannon. Good range, not as good as a laser, but ridiculous power. He used a Class 2 fusion cannon despite being a Class 1 bot. It was almost too big for his hands, which cut down on his accuracy, but Grinder didn't worry about accuracy. Doc had to cut down a bit to fit in his payload, which also cut down on his accuracy, but again, Grinder didn't worry about accuracy. He watched his blaster fire zapped past Forager in the air. The two Seekers had to slow down to stay behind Forager. They were faster than Forager, but he was significantly more maneuverable. Seekers, the flyers anyway, were macro changers. They were only Class 2 bots, but their alt form was Class 4. It gave them considerably more speed and atmosphere, but it also made them bigger, easier targets. Forager, bless his spark, was flying towards them as fast as he could while juking and dodging the Seekers' continuous fire. Just a little bit closer. Come on, Forager. Come on. It wasn't exactly a surprise when the fusion cannon fired, but it wasn't entirely expected either. Squeezing the trigger was an art. Grinder was an artist. The shot connected and the Seeker on the left burst apart. Fusion cannons were incredibly powerful. Grinder glanced to the ground. Grunt was standing out in the open, his ion pistol out, firing towards the Seekers. They were out of range of his little pistol. Secundus didn't fire. He was probably waiting for a better shot. Let the enemy get closer. Why waste a good ambush on a chancy shot? He wouldn't get a chance to shoot if Grinder had anything to say about it. The remaining Seeker veered off out of range. That was not good. Was he running? Seekers usually weren't smart enough to retreat. Forager juked, pulling the kind of G's that would cause a fleshling pilot to black out, shifting his engines around to pull a crazy Ivan, getting the Seeker back under his sights. Forager whipped off a shot, but it went wild. The Seeker continued his turn while banking toward the sky, trying to get Forager back in his sights. Chaos taken. The Seeker was closer, but still out of Grinder's range. You're out of range, Forager. Lead him in. That was Secundus. The fearless leader wasn't completely useless after all. I'm trying, Forager replied, his voice clearly strained. It was an AM broadcast. Radio wave transceivers were standard organs on all Cybertronians. There were no particular reason it should sound strained, but it did, and the bots who didn't sound strained or convey emotions were considered weird. Grinder waited. There wasn't much he could do until the Seeker got a little bit closer. The Seeker completed his turn while Forager got 2 shots off on him, missing both. The Decepticon crested his ascent, and dropping his nose to dive down on Forager and hopefully get off a shot. Forager, being a better pilot, wasn't where the Decepticon expected him to be. After he took a few shots at the Seeker, the Autobot airplane veered off in the opposite direction, headed back towards the Autobot ambush. Once the Decepticon figured that out, he reoriented himself and took off after Forager. With his greater speed, the Seeker quickly got within range of Forager. Unfortunately for him, that put him inside range of both Secundus and Grinder. Grinder fired first. A beam of purple nuclear energy lanced out and connected with the Decepticon jet. The jet didn't explode, but its nose dropped, and clearly the engines weren't firing anymore. Good enough for Grinder. If the shot didn't kill him, the fall would. Right before the Seeker hit the ground, its nose jerked up, and the afterburners kicked in hard, rocketing the Seeker back into the sky. No fair, I hit him, Grinder growled over the comms as he lined up his next shot. A blast of energy erupted from Secundus' position, connecting with the Seeker and blowing a wing off. It started spiraling towards the ground. No reason to waste energy by firing more shots. The fall would take the Seeker offline. Nice shooting, boss, Forager said over the air. Grinder shook his head. The Explorer would never compliment him, despite Grinder doing most of the hard work. Thanks for... Ah! Grinder was cut off. Secundus was cut off. Grinder jerked his head over to the hole. He couldn't see Secundus from his vantage point. Grunt was already running back towards the hole. Grinder waited a moment, then asked, Doc? Boss? No answer. Grunt made it over the hole and looked in. I think they're okay. Give me 1 minute here. Needed a drink of water. Grinder waited for Grunt to fill them in. When the strong bot didn't say anything, he asked, What happened, Grunt? Grinder could feel his ire peaking as Grunt didn't answer him, but held up a finger, gesturing for Grinder to wait. He didn't point the finger in Grinder's direction. Had that walking, talking protoform forgotten where he was? After a moment, the strong bot said, Forager, the boss says to get down here. Grinder, You're on guard duty. And with that, the dumb bot jumped in the hole. Wait, Forager said. I have questions. Too late, Grinder said, sighing. You're not going to get radio waves through the ground. You'll need line of sight. So what do we do? Forager asked. If Forager was the higher rank, he should be telling Grinder what to do, not the other way around. Land. Don't go down the hole and tell me what's going on. I'm guessing the scrap they were digging through gave out and they fell. Cybertron was now a ruin of a planet, but some parts were worse than others. Grinder didn't know what this stretch of land had been before the war, but it was rubble piled on debris. It was rubble piled on debris, piled on scrap now. Apparently it wasn't very stable either. Okay, landing. Unlike a conventional airplane, Forager didn't have to land on his wheels. He made a conventional approach to the hole, slowing airspeed and getting lower to the ground, but before he touched down he transformed, kicked in his anti-gravity repulsors, and floated to the ground. Flight is difficult to master. Most transformers never try. One good wind shear can ruin your day. There was no need to fly before the war. You could literally drive from planet to planet on space bridges. There was nothing stopping you either. If you wanted to learn to fly, you could change your alt mode and get the surgery to give you robot flight. Grinder used to be a fighter jet back when he was a Class 3. This new body, though, had no flight capacity whatsoever, and there weren't the sort of resources available now to outfit him for flight. It wasn't fair. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Grinder scanned the skies. Without Forager in the air with his radar, this was going to be even more dangerous. Such a bad idea. What could they possibly find that was worth this risk? Yeah, they fell. That was Forager over the radio. Grinder snapped his head back toward the hole. Forager was standing at the edge of the hole. That's pretty deep. Is Doc okay? Grinder asked, trying to keep the edge of concern out of his voice. If Doc went offline, then the entire planet might as well go offline. He was the only one left who knew how to run a Vector Sigma, and without the Allspark, a Vector Sigma was the only way Grinder knew of to make new Transformers. The fate of the species hung in the hands of the smallest Class 1 Grinder had ever met. He's walking around down there, let me ask. A pause. Yeah, he's all right. A pause. You guys found what? A pause. Okay, I won't broadcast it. A pause. Hey, Grinder, keep an eye out. I'm heading down. What in the name of Primus and all the light he brought could they have ever found down that hole that was worth taking this kind of a chance? One Decepticon rocket right now, even a Class 1 laser could collapse that hole and take out all four of them. And take all four of them offline. This was just stupid. Well, it probably wouldn't offline Grunt. Great. All the hopes of his species, his planet, the galaxy itself, hung on the shoulders of a strong bot with the IQ of soup. Grinder did not take comfort in that thought. He redoubled his efforts in scanning the sky and took pleasure in silently cursing out Secundus for making him take that stupid solar port instead of his radar. It was hours later when Grunt jumped out of the hole. Literally just jumped out of it. How deep was the hole if Grunt could jump out of it? Hey, Grinder, guess what? I found a jetpack. Grunt was facing the wrong direction, holding up a jetpack. Grinder shook his head. The IQ of soup. That's great, Grunt. What's going on down there? Hold on, I can't broadcast it. I'll come to you. Grunt put the jetpack into his payload and started running the wrong way. Seriously. Wrong way, Grunt. Grinder looked around the skies, still clear. Either the Decepticons didn't get a message off to their crew, or they were so busy arming up they would overwhelm Secundus' little crew. With Grinder's luck, it was the overwhelm option. Grunt stopped and turned around, looking for Grinder. Grinder sighed and stood up, waving at Grunt. Strongbox saw him and ran toward him as Grunt got back under his concealment. Other Transformers would have gone into alt mode to cover the distance quicker, but Grunt was a lousy driver. In fact, the only driver Grinder knew of that was worse was Doc. It's like their entire crew was from the island of misfit toys. No wonder Grinder fit in so well with them. You're never going to guess what we found, Grinder, Grunt finally asked when he got close enough to shout and be heard. At least he didn't broadcast it. At the impatience and anxiety, all the impatience and anxiety he had felt since Secundus had first proposed this train wreck of a mission was about to boil over. Grunt didn't deserve it, but Grinder was about to yell at him. He managed to keep a lid on his anger, but just barely. Tell me.
A spaceship!
Grinder was grinning at him.
There was an extra jetpack in the ship, and Secundus said I could have it.
What was seriously wrong with Grunt that he was excited about a jetpack? Maybe Grinder had died on that battlefield, or worse, he was still there, and this was all some fever dream as he lay dying, his spark chamber running out of power. Forget the jetpack. Tell me about this spaceship. What idiocy was Secundus planning now?
But Secundus said I could keep the jetpack. I didn't want to forget it. Grunt!
Grinder closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then a deeper one. Finally, when he was calm, he said, Grunt, focus. Tell me what they said about the spaceship. Grunt stared at him for a minute.
Is something wrong with you?
He almost screamed at him. Almost. Instead, Grinder settled for sarcasm. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Please tell me.
I got a jetpack about...
Grinder pulled himself back from yelling. Yelling would only make it worse. About the ship, Grunt.
Oh, that.
Grunt stopped and stared off in the distance for a bit. Then he grinned and looked back at Grinder.
We're making this our new base. I'm supposed to help you set up some defenses.
Grinder slapped his own forehead. It was like talking to a metal ingot. Why?
Doc thinks he can get the ship running again. They're talking about leaving Cybertron. I think it's a good idea. I miss fleshlings.
That was a horrible plan. Giving up Cybertron to the Decepticons? It was giving up. It was admitting failure. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. What were they thinking? Seriously, though, that was going to be the best he would get out of Grunt. He would need to wait to get a better situation report from one of the others. Grinder looked around, this time at the ground, taking in the landscape with an eye toward tactics. He would have to draw up the plans. Doc and Secundus would be focused on getting the ship running. Why? Why leave Cybertron? Why? Sure, they were outnumbered 10-1, and the planet was little more than a scrap heap now, but it was still their home. And they were winning. The Decepticons were sure to run out of Energon in a decade or 6. Why leave? And that ends Chapter 3 of my Cybertronian Misadventure here. This is Beas from Blam Blam Truckers, and thanks for listening. Keep on trucking, you Blam Blam Truckers.